I've been having a lot of conversation lately with startup founders, executives, entrepreneurs, parents about emotional intelligence. And I wanted to just share in a previous life position, I was the CEO of a startup called UEQ, and we developed something called neuro gamification. So it was using game dynamics to impact brain science or brain development and emotional intelligence, especially in the areas of social emotional learning. And the reason I got into that was because I myself needed emotional intelligence. So a little backstory, there was a time when I had the emotional intelligence of this pen, this stylus, and you can ask my wife. And so she would come to me and she would tell me a problem and sort of unload her day. And then I would just say, you know what? It's easy. Just do this, this, and this. And you know what you should do? You should do this. And you made a mistake because of this. And this is why this happens. And she would look at me and say, I didn't tell you all this so you could just fix my problems. And my response would be, well, then why are you telling me? What's the point in telling me if you don't want your problems fixed? So you can see or imagine how well my marriage went for very many years. And one of the reasons I lacked emotional intelligence and a lot of the social skills, such as empathy, was because of childhood trauma. So I'd grown up in a family and there was emotional abuse. Allegedly, there's physical abuse, but the issue was that I had blocked out those memories and I have a complete blank when it comes to my childhood, which is a common response to developmental and traumatic events. So developmental trauma and trauma that's done to you, such as, abuse or something horrific happening in your life. And so I didn't develop a lot of the skills because that part of my brain was, in fact, shut down. And I had an emotional intelligence coach who specialized in the brain science of high performers tell me one day the reason you're struggling with certain things in your life is because you're only using half your brain. And that was an interesting thing. And I asked him, well, tell me more, like what's the reason? And I learned the difference between the right side of the brain, the left side of the brain, etc. Won't go into it. What I learned was that emotional intelligence is a skill that you can develop and became the single greatest competitive advantage that I had as a leader, which then removed sort of the ceiling that I had in terms of my success in my business ventures, as well as family relationships with my children, especially my wife, saved my marriage, actually. What I've learned is that people learn emotional intelligence in very specific ways. Brain development is brain development. And I've tested out methodologies and techniques all around the world, including some of the largest boardrooms and corporate training rooms in China and different types of companies, Fortune 500, Fortune 100, been there and been training emotional intelligence. That's one of the reasons I went to China. And to this day, UEQ continues to go on, although I'm no longer the CEO of that company. What I want to share with you are some tricks and tips that I've learned in terms of the fastest way to develop emotional intelligence. And the reason for this is I am an executive coach. And so when an executive pays me, hopefully large sums of money, they don't have the luxury of, let's say, life coaching and a therapist and counseling to keep coming. They need results as quick as possible. So I had to be very efficient in the way that I taught emotional intelligence. And therefore, I developed specific techniques. And UEQ still uses a lot of the game dynamics, gamification, neuro gamification products that I developed. But what I want to do is show you a real quick way, one of the first techniques that I learned to develop emotional intelligence, and anybody can do it. And I will demonstrate it. What's important, again, is to understand that emotional intelligence is a skill. It does not matter. A lot of people say, I just don't have emotional intelligence and I'll never learn it. And I say, that's not true. You can learn emotional intelligence just like leadership as a skill. Leaders are not born, they are made. And anybody can learn to be a leader, just as anybody can learn emotional intelligence. And so what research has shown is the fastest way to develop emotional intelligence is to use emotional vocabulary. And one of the reasons is that you have neural pathways in your brain And the more your neural pathways are built to access emotional vocabulary, the more you'll be using higher executive function to analyze and develop the self-awareness of your emotional intelligence. And self-awareness being one of the cornerstones, if you study the models out there, like John Gottman or Daniel Goleman, in terms of emotional intelligence, self-awareness is the first thing. It's the know thyself, self-awareness. So we have self-awareness. And so how do you do this? Well, when I was younger, when I was lacking emotional intelligence, I only had a few emotional intelligence vocabulary words. It was happy, sad, mad, really mad. That was that's what I thought the emotional intelligence was. But what happens is when you start developing a rich, robust vocabulary, and they've done studies in this, that people with high emotional intelligence use more emotional vocabulary words, then what happens is that you start to develop emotional intelligence. There's a correlation to vocabulary words, emotional vocabulary. The problem is most people mix up emotional vocabulary and thinking vocabulary. In other words, what they do is that they'll say something like, imagine this conversation. You and I were having a talk, and I say to you, I feel like you're not listening to me. And that is actually not a congruent statement in terms of how your brain works, because what's happening is you don't actually feel like someone's not listening to you. Although some people may say, it's my intuition, I got a vibe, et cetera. You actually are perceiving, which means you're thinking that someone's not listening to you, which actually is preceded by an emotion, that's something that you picked up, because the right side of your brain processes situations and looks at facial expression, body language, tone, etc., and fires much faster than your left brain. So what happens is you felt something, but it's led you to think something. So therefore, instead of I feel like you're not listening to me, it's what you think. You think someone is not listening to you. So I should be saying, I think you're not listening to me. But let's add some emotional vocabulary for a moment. And if I said, I feel ignored because I think you're not listening to me, or I feel somewhat rejected, or if I said, I feel a little rejected or insecure because I think you're not listening to me, how would that land for you? Well, what happens is your brain is designed to pick up emotions a lot faster, and therefore the connection happens very quickly. Now you have a choice. You can either respond to my emotions, or you can just go about your day, etc. But for me, I'm processing the emotional vocabulary, and the reason I think that you're not listening to me, or the result that there's a correlation between thoughts and feelings, that I feel rejected because you're not listening to me. And then I can deal with the feelings of rejection regardless of whether you're going to listen to me or not. And that's only going to benefit me. So therefore, you can start to use this emotional vocabulary and lead with your emotional vocabulary. And one of the things is to use your words. Think about it. When children are growing up and they're crying and they're on emotional tantrum, like they're emotionally hijacked, one of the techniques is use your words. What are you feeling? And as soon as they start using their words, higher executive function kicks in and you start to self-regulate. So using emotional vocabulary actually helps you self-regulate. And it may seem a little like voodoo magic, and you may be thinking, well, what's the point? Because we're conditioned to think emotions are weakness. So we don't want to lead with the emotions, but it's very impactful because the brain is the brain and people are going to pick that up. So there have been times when I've been in a meeting and I've said, hey, I would like to start off by sharing something transparent. And I would say, I feel disheartened because I think that these negotiations are not going the way that I'd hoped, or I think any of us had hoped. However, I have trust. I feel trust and I feel optimistic because I think we can get through to the end of this. You see what I did there? And a lot of times fellow executives would sort of elbow me and say, what are you doing? You can't lead with that sort of thing. But sometimes people just acknowledge and say nothing. And other times people will resonate and they say, wow, thank you. And they're acknowledging my vulnerability, even though they may not use that language. Or some people may be relieved and say, wow, I was feeling that too. And I thought, and misunderstandings occur and what have you. Now, it doesn't matter how the other person responds, because part of emotional intelligence is taking responsibility for your own emotions and your own reaction to them. So therefore, if you start to use emotional vocabulary based on how you feel, it's going to be fantastic. Let me give you another example of a very powerful emotion that I've used to describe what's going on for me, and that is the emotion of shame. Shame is a very powerful emotion, and it can be appropriate or inappropriate, leave you stuck. But there's been times where I have spoken to my family, and I paused them when I was learning this, and I'd say, wait a second. I feel ashamed that I've let you down. And then I'll adjust that. I feel ashamed because I think I've let everybody down. And my family just automatically goes in empathy mode. Instead of me being defensive or trying to defend myself, I actually acknowledge that I'm feeling ashamed. And again, in society today, especially for men, unfortunately, sharing emotions, it's sort of been drilled into us a lot by society growing up that sharing emotions is weakness. But the more vulnerable I am, and I've learned this with my wife and with other people, the more vulnerable I am, the more authentic I come across, and the more people connect with me, and the more empathy we can share for one another, which releases things like oxytocin, which is kind of what they call the love hormone or the cuddle hormone, but it's actually a cooperation and collaboration hormone as well. And therefore just being vulnerable and authentic with emotions. So a lot of times I will ask people in a meeting just to check in and give me one word to describe your emotions. And instead of, it can't be good, it can't be bad, it can't be happy. It needs to be emotions with a little bit of context or a little bit of texture, additional vibrancy and variety. And just by that exercise of people trying to find emotions and then describing the reason they feel those emotions brings everybody together. So here's what you want to do. Practice your emotional vocabulary. Try to speak with people and just practice with someone really close. And you go to them and say, I feel, and watch for the differences between I feel and I think. And there's a massive difference. Remember, the brain is not designed to process thoughts as feelings and feelings as thoughts. So use the words I feel. And this is what my executive coach used to do. It was an infuriating exercise. He would say, how are you feeling? And I would say, well, I feel like we can do this. And he'd say, that's not how you feel. That's what you think. And I'd say, okay, I feel like I'm turning a corner. No, that's not. And I just couldn't get it. And then I would stop and I go, okay, I feel optimistic. And then pow, that changed the whole context of the conversation. And I started to change those words around and start developing emotional intelligence naturally. And the reason I say it's the fastest way is just by practicing it, you're developing new neural pathways in your brain and you're developing emotional intelligence. So for example, instead of saying, wow, I feel happy for you, I will say something like, wow, I feel elated to hear about your good news. And that just hits the person much differently. And you're going to see this happen when you're managing people or with your family or you're negotiating with clients. So use emotional vocabulary. Now be appropriate. This is extremely important. Don't just dump your emotions. You can actually flood other people's brains. Appropriate, no, that's not how you spell it. Excuse me. Appropriately. Let's do that. That's how you spell it, right? Okay, appropriately. So use your emotions appropriately. So don't just slam the emotions down and make everybody awkward. Use them appropriately, but put them in. So you can tell your kids, I'm feeling a little irritated right now, instead of just blowing off and yelling at them. You can stop them and say, I just want to let you know I'm feeling a little irritated right now. And that's going to regulate you, calm them down, teach them empathy, to listen to your emotional cues, etc. It's a powerful thing. So use I feel and gather some emotional intelligence using your words. I mean, gather your words to develop emotional intelligence, develop your emotional vocabulary, but use it appropriately as you practice, and you will start to see the results happen pretty quickly. I hope that helps you get started. Try it. You never know until you try it. Just go to somebody close to you and just say, I'd like to try something out with you. I feel, and come up with something and say that, and then just let them react to what you just said. A lot of times people will be really surprised, especially if you're not someone who goes out with those emotions, and you'll start to see the reaction that people have, the positive effect, which only creates this feedback loop where you get rewarded for doing it over and over again, and you'll just be excited to develop emotional intelligence skills. So again, try it out. And if you like this type of content, we'll see how popular it is. I'll get into some of the other techniques that you can develop really quickly from an executive coaching perspective, and we'll go from there. Thanks for watching.